we need to have a talk. We need to have a talk about one of those stories of Jesus that can't help but make us unsettled. Almost like no matter what you do with it, there's something difficult about it. And I'm convinced that in the life of God's people, as in life in general, it is better for us to face the things that make us uncomfortable, rather than pretending they aren't there or that they don't cause the difficulties that they do. I don't pretend that one conversation here is going to resolve all the tensions or difficulties or open questions in this story, but the only way we're going to get anywhere with making sense of the story and what it means for us maybe too is by facing it and looking at the story, maybe figuring out some possibilities of what Jesus is up to and what it might mean for what Jesus is up to right here and now. So I want to ask you to follow along with me. This is a story that comes out of Mark chapter 7, and you'll find it in verses 24 through 30. This is a part of what we're going to be hearing and focusing on this coming Sunday in our worship life. From there, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syro-Phoenician origin. She begged him to cast out the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. That's complicated. And at first, it sounds like Jesus kind of comes off like a jerk. Like, why would you refuse somebody? And on top of that, it sure sounds like Jesus had said something really offensive to this woman, to call her a dog. That's not a compliment, right? Let's unpack for a minute. How do we even approach the dynamics going on in this story? Before we even get to what does it mean for you and for me, how do we even approach this? I want to suggest a really important thing happens in Jesus' life and ministry here, even if Mark, the narrator, doesn't announce it or herald it with a voice from heaven or the descending of a dove or a sunbeam and thunder or something like that. Something really important is happening in the story of Jesus' life and ministry. And that's what Mark gives us in the gospel. This ever-widening reach of where Jesus is sent and to whom Jesus is sent. And from time to time you can feel that tension. Jesus has come as Israel's Messiah, and yet the stretching is always outward. The direction, the momentum, the trajectory is always wider, wider, wider in who is included. That isn't just an all or nothing one-time event, but Jesus' ministry shows this sort of gradual opening wider and wider and wider beyond the bounds of ethnic biological Israel, beyond the bounds of people who believed in the faith according to Judaism, beyond the bounds of those deemed acceptable by the old systems and rules. And anytime we get talking about a God who breaks and crosses the boundaries we set up, we all get unsettled. So some of this story and what makes it uncomfortable for us is our baggage, because we like boundaries and we like saying, you're in, you're out, you're on my team, you don't count. And Jesus being open to the expansion of boundaries seems kind of difficult. On the other hand, the fact that Jesus doesn't right away go, of course you get a healing, here you go, that makes it uncomfortable. Let me ask you to start not with questions about dogs or children's crumbs or this particular woman from a Syro-Phoenician background, but let's start somewhere safer. Let's start with sheep. What is the image? What does the word, the picture of a sheep mean to you? What comes along with that picture? I know there's no sheep in this story, so maybe it's a little bit safer, easier to talk about, to think about. What goes along with sheep? In this day and age, I'll be honest, a lot of the times when I hear people talk about sheep, it's in this sort of negative context. You'll hear people talk about that, people who are upset about the pandemic or wearing a mask or getting vaccinated, and they use it in this sort of negative, pejorative way. Don't be a sheep. Don't just do what somebody else tells you to do. And see, you'll often hear that kind of language, that if you just go along with the crowd, you're being a sheep. That's bad. You're doing what somebody else is telling you to do, the way sheep just kind of, in a docile way, just sort of do whatever the other sheep in the flock do. And I get that, and I understand how that's used, but Christians ought to have like alarm bells going off in our head anytime somebody goes, don't be a sheep, because the New Testament has a very different picture of what it is to be sheep. Yeah, sometimes wayward, but the New Testament absolutely depicts us as the follower of Jesus as sheep and Jesus as our shepherd. So for us, it's less the question of should I be a sheep or not, but rather who will I follow? Who will I listen to? But the scriptures, both the Old Testament Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament and the Gospels, show that image of being a sheep not as a bad thing, but as an honest picture about we are people who are easily persuadable, who are awfully needy and need the guidance of a good shepherd. We need Jesus to be our shepherd. So yeah, pay attention and don't just casually go follow anybody claiming to have authority, to be sure, but there's no way of getting around being a sheep. The thing I want you to hold on to is that idea that in some people's mind, sheep is an unavoidably bad image, negative. There's nothing redeemable or good about it. And then on the other hand, the New Testament reframes what it means to be a sheep and sees it in a different light. I want to suggest something like that happens in this story with that imagery of being a dog. Jesus doesn't invent that idea of using that in a negative light. It's not only sort of a customary ancient image in some cultures of seeing dogs as these unclean kind of animals or as sort of scavengers that roam the streets. Jesus didn't invent that. There's a lot of ancient voices, especially out of Judaism, that sort of use that imagery. Calling somebody a dog in an ancient Middle Eastern culture like that makes sense because dogs are seen as these sort of like, wild, scavenging, vicious, maybe sort of creatures. And that's sort of standard language. This is not me endorsing, talking about people one way or another using animal imagery to talk about people. But Jesus doesn't invent this. That's sort of the baggage just floating in the air back then. And yet, in a Greek or Roman culture where dogs are pets, it's not an insult to be a dog necessarily. That's the family pet. Yeah, we have dogs who would sit at our table and eat. Ancient Judaism doesn't have dogs as pets. That's just not a thing. So to call somebody a dog in that context is like this very negative sort of, it's an insult. And yet, to other ears, it would be, well, maybe it's not such a bad thing. Maybe I could be the pet. Maybe I belong. Maybe there's belonging and protection and guarding. Maybe there's worthiness. What I want to suggest is this woman does something amazing. She reframes the image Jesus lobs out. Jesus says, well, it wouldn't be right to take what I have to offer and not give it to the people I've been sent to. I've been sent to the people of Israel. It wouldn't be right for me to take what should go to them and just give it to anywhere, to some scavenger or something. Jesus lobs that out using sort of the language of the day. And yet this one reframes. Well, okay, if you want to play that game there, sir, stranger, rabbi, person, if you want to play that game, maybe this image of being a dog isn't the negative, scavenger, dangerous thing that that imagery has been used for. Maybe in my culture, dogs are these welcome parts of the family. That reframing changes things. In part, it says this woman has some kind of tenacious trust or faith that Jesus is able to do something. That she's willing to have this pushback with Jesus. That's a big deal, right? This is a kind of scandalous conversation. In a Greek or Roman or in a Jewish context, there's a lot of boundaries being crossed here. Jesus has crossed the border into Gentile territory. And on top of that, this woman, and there's lots of taboos about women talking with men who are not biologically related to them out in public. This conversation itself. So she's got something that is tenacious and real, and that she's willing to push back on Jesus. What's Jesus going to do with that? By the end of the conversation, Jesus accepts this reframing. Okay, yeah, you're not a danger or a scavenger or somehow harmful. It would be a bad choice to take the children's food and throw it out to scavengers, coyotes out in the woods behind your house. That leaves kids hungry and invites predators to come into your neighborhood. But what if we're not talking about that? What if we're talking about your own pet dog who loves and guards and protects you? Oh, that reframes things. That changes things. This woman's willingness to push back on Jesus' metaphor says that she really has come believing he's capable of doing something. There's more to it than just she's heard a rumor that Jesus is this wonder worker and she wants to be entertained. She comes with some kind of deep awareness Jesus is able to help, and she dares to believe Jesus has the compassion to help, even though she has no claim on him. She doesn't say, you have to because I'm come from the right people of God, or I come from the right ethnicity, or I have the right religious background. She just says, my daughter has a need. You're able to help. I need your help. And she reframes the whole conversation that way. Sometimes I think people get uncomfortable with this way of entering the story because it sounds like Jesus learned something or changed his mind about something, and that makes us uncomfortable because we say, well, Jesus is God in a human life, so Jesus can't change his mind. He has to know everything from the beginning, and we got to wrestle with that because we do say Jesus is divine, is God with us in a human life, and that part of being human is that learning and growing. And whether you like it or not, to say Jesus is divine and human means at some point Jesus had to learn stuff. He doesn't come springing forth on Christmas morning laid in the manger already knowing how to speak or read or write or how to dress himself or feed himself. Jesus had to learn all those things. At some point, Jesus, in real lived experience, comes across this woman who is an outsider, and everything Jesus has grown up with said, these outsiders are bad. And Jesus opens up the possibility, well, let me meet some of these outsiders. Let me see. And discover that they're not terrible, rotten, mean, awful people. They're not child eaters or dangerous or violent. This woman cares deeply about her child. Where would Jesus have gotten that kind of exposure to this outsider before a moment like this, right? Kid Jesus grows up in the heart of the nation state, the place of Israel. It's occupied under the Roman government, but Jesus would have been surrounded by other Jewish people like him. He's from a small town. There's not a whole lot of hustle and bustle between people from faraway places. In Nazareth and in Galilee, maybe there's some other non-Jewish people around. But again, most of his circles are going to be other people exactly like him. At some point, Jesus chooses to put himself in a place where he will encounter someone who is different. And when he sees her with a face, when he sees her story and hears that she loves her kid like anybody, that she's a human being, that she's intelligent and thoughtful and creative, and that she can push back on Jesus' line of thought, this breaks apart whatever stereotypes there might have been. And to be sure, Jesus had grown up in a place where there were stereotypes about those people, those Gentile people. They're not like us. They're not good enough. They're not acceptable. They don't worship our God, keep our commandments, follow our dietary rules, have the right religion, offer the right sacrifice. There's all sorts of reasons they're bad and they're wrong. At some point, Jesus chooses to put himself in a position where that stereotype can be broken, where he will learn something one way or another. Are those stereotypes I grew up with true or no? That's the other piece I think we may have missed by jumping right into the part that seems so fraught. We skip over the beginning of this story. Jesus makes the choice to go to this place called Tyre, which is Gentile territory, non-Jewish territory. Now, Mark, the narrator, says he wants to get away from being recognized. He wants to find a place by himself. But my goodness, what does Jesus expect is going to happen going into Gentile territory, crossing the border out of your country into another country? You're going to run into people that you would have called foreigners. But now Jesus is the foreigner. Jesus puts himself as the outsider. Who does he think he's going to run into there except other Gentile people? He's going to have to come face to face and learn something, discover something. Oh, my goodness, these people aren't all terrible, aren't awful. These are people who are beloved and included in the reign of God as well. At some point, This has to move beyond an abstract, are Gentiles in the abstract loved by God, or is God's goodness and blessing only for insiders? It has to move from the abstract, it comes to having human faces attached to it. That's a choice on Jesus' part. Jesus chooses in a moment like this to go to a place where he's going to run into outsiders, almost as if to say, I need to learn for myself. I need to come and learn the stories of people who are different from me, and to discover as I meet them and hear their stories that God's love is for them too. You can know that in an abstract sense, but until something has a face to it, man, things change. When you meet somebody who is different and you discover God's love includes them as well. This woman pushes back and she reframes that whole notion of what it means to be a dog. And instead of being this sort of dangerous scavenger animal, we're talking about someone who is loyal and faithful and lovable. That changes things. And Jesus has put himself in a place where that kind of encounter is going to happen. And again, in the wider arc of how Mark tells this story, Jesus increasingly pushes those boundaries, puts himself in places where those boundaries will be pushed, knowing that that's the kind of thing it seems like God is leading him to do. Even if everybody's expectation is he's only come for Israelites, Jesus keeps pushing the boundaries. He's the one gathering his disciples. Let's cross to the other side of the sea. And he meets a man possessed by an evil spirit, by a legion of them where they're herding pigs. That's Gentile territory. Here's Jesus crossing into Gentile territory, going on personal retreat. And again, Gentiles welcome. Outsiders end up having help for them as well. Jesus has this way of breaking down boundaries, and this story shows it happening in real time. And the key, I think, especially for people like you and like me maybe, who are used to living in places of sameness, who surround our daily and weekly routines with people who are like us, who fit our demographic boxes, who look like us, maybe went to the same school as us or had the same kind of basic experience, who feel like we're the majority population or whatever. Part of how we learn how big and wide and blessed God's reign is by coming to meet people and seeing people's faces. It is so easy, especially in this era in which we live, as much as it was easy in Jesus' day, to see the world divided into these sort of vague, faceless crowds. There's us and there's them. But when you meet somebody who is different, whose culture is different, whose skin color is different, whose background is different, whose faith looks different, whose family picture doesn't fit your cookie-cutter assumption of how a family is supposed to look like, whose love is different than what yours is, whose way of life is in some ways very, very different. When you come and discover these people have stories and faces and are beloved just like you are, and they struggle like you do, and they have insights and creativity and humor. When you come to meet people you would have lumped in as them and see faces and you let others see your face, it changes things. And maybe you can't help in that moment but to discover, oh, God's love includes them too. I know it can feel uncomfortable to hear a story where it seems like Jesus changes his mind or learns something or growth happens. That seems to be what Mark is giving us. And instead of Mark ironing all that out or giving us an editorial line underneath, if Jesus knew exactly what was going to happen and he made sure it happened this way, he just gives us this raw data. Jesus goes in and the beginning of the story presents itself like Jesus is not going to help, and then realizes by the conversation's turn, yep, this woman, even though she's an outsider, God's love is for her. God's blessing, God's goodness is for her. Jesus has put himself in the kind of situation where something like this was going to happen. I think we need to give Jesus credit for that too. Jesus chooses to put himself in one of those positions where he's going to have to eventually go on record saying, yes, God's love is for outsiders. Yes, God's love is for people everybody else thought were not good enough, not acceptable enough. Jesus makes that choice. I want to suggest maybe there's a place for you and me to live out this story as well. Long, long time ago, the church seemed to have settled the question of whether Gentiles are allowed in. Yep, I'm a Gentile, non-Jewish background, and yet I find a welcome among the people of Jesus. And yet, every time I settle into those patterns of sameness, where we sort of silo ourselves by like-mindedness, whether it's political affiliation or people who like rural life versus urban life, or people who have lots and lots of advanced degrees, or people who didn't go beyond high school or maybe didn't finish high school. There's all sorts of ways we sort of cluster ourselves around people who are only like us and then have a way of assuming, if you're not like me, you're not good enough. What happens when we deliberately put ourselves in situations where we encounter someone who is different, who is other, and we're other to them? When we find ourselves in situations like that, something important happens, and we discover God's love, God's reign, God's goodness is bigger and wider, and it happens in those times when we come to see a face on a story. Instead of seeing somebody as just as you're too different, you're one of them, you're not one of us. Jesus himself models that vulnerability. It's vulnerable not only to be the foreigner. Jesus is the one who crosses out of what was his home territory into another place where he's the outsider and everybody's looking at him like he's the stranger. And on top of that, Jesus puts himself in the position where he's in a position to learn or change his mind or grow. Whatever else we say about Jesus as the divine Son of God, and I confess every Sunday, every week in our worship life, here's Jesus, Son of God, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, and yet human. And part of what it is to be human is to grow and learn. And just like infant Jesus has to learn things like being fed and learning to speak and read and write, and does clearly all those things, and that learning is somehow theologically okay. Here's one of those moments where Jesus walking into the story seems to think, I'm not sure if she's really included. And by the end, yes, it's clear. Yes, God's love reaches out and includes her as well. What if this week you and I took the risk of putting ourselves in situations where those kinds of encounters can happen? Choosing intentionally to pick up a conversation with somebody you know you don't agree with on some things, and instead of immediately berating them or yelling at them or lobbing sort of straw man arguments about why they're wrong, listen, tell me about what you think about this and why. Where does that come from and what leads you to think that? Tell me about your experience. To intentionally place ourselves in conversation with people who are different, to intentionally learn and to see the image of God in people who are different from us. It is so tempting always to silo ourselves with sameness. What if today we had the courage Jesus, the divine Son of God, shows us here to cross some boundaries and to learn to see the image of God in the faces of people we would have just called them or the other before? What would happen if we allow somebody else who views us as them, as those people, to come and learn the image of God in us as well? As scary as that is, I'm convinced when we do that, we're going where Jesus leads us. This is a messy conversation and a difficult story. But I invite you, reflect on it with us and join us on Sunday morning as we dig deeper into this conversation and this story and find ourselves led to go where Jesus goes. See you Sunday.